The boxing gym was alive with noise that day. The sound of gloves pounding heavy bags echoed through the room. Trainers barked instructions. The skipping ropes tapped against the floor. And the smell of sweat mixed with chalk hung in the air. Young fighters, full of energy, were moving quickly, jumping, punching, shouting. It was a place where strength and speed ruled, and nobody expected anything unusual to happen. Then the door creaked open. An elderly black man stepped inside. He walked slowly, his back slightly bent, his clothes simple and worn. His shoes looked old, his hands rough, and his face carried lines that spoke of a long life lived. The moment he entered, the energy of the gym shifted. Fighters glanced at him, some pausing mid-punch, some smirking at the unexpected sight. He didn't look like a boxer. He didn't even look like someone who belonged there. His hair was gray, his beard patchy, and his eyes tired yet sharp. He carried no fancy gym bag, no shiny gloves, no modern gear. Just a small duffel slung over his shoulder. To the young men in the gym, he looked out of place, maybe even ridiculous. A few of them chuckled quietly. One leaned toward his friend and whispered, "What's he doing here? Looking for his grandson?" Another laughed louder. "Maybe he's lost. Somebody show him the way to the senior center." Their words carried across the room, and more heads turned. Soon, the gym was buzzing with mocking comments, but the old man didn't react. He didn't look left or right. He walked past the stairs in whispers, heading straight toward an empty bench. He set his bag down carefully and began to untie his shoes. His movements were slow but steady, as calm as though he had done this many times before. A few trainers raised their eyebrows, curious but doubtful. One of them muttered under his breath, "This isn't the place for him." Another shook his head, dismissing the old man as a fool. Still, the stranger continued quietly. He pulled out a pair of worn boxing shoes, their leather cracked from years of use. He slid them on, lacing them with careful precision. Then came the wrap-soled cotton strips, faded and frayed. He wrapped his hands with the skill of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Each loop, each knot, was done without hesitation. Some of the fighters stopped laughing. They noticed the way he wrapped his wrists firm, correct, professional. It wasn't the clumsy wrapping of a beginner. It was the precise habit of someone who knew the sport well. Still, they dismissed it quickly. Age, they thought, erases skill. The old man rose from the bench and looked around the gym. His eyes weren't filled with arrogance or pride. They were steady, focused, like a man who knew why he was there. He walked slowly toward the ring in the center. The laughter returned, louder this time. "Where's he going?" One fighter called out, grinning, "Careful, Grandpa, you might break a hip climbing up there." Another shouted, sending waves of laughter through the gym. But still, the man didn't answer. He placed his hands on the ropes and leaned forward, watching two young fighters spar inside. He studied their footwork, their jabs, their rhythm. His face remained calm, almost unreadable. The trainer of the fighters noticed him and frowned. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his tone polite but sharp. The old man simply said, "I want to spar." The gym froze for a second. Fighters exchanged stunned looks, then erupted into laughter. "Did you hear that?" someone shouted. "He wants to spar." The room shook with amusement. Even the fighters in the ring chuckled, lowering their gloves. But the old man stood firm. His voice had not been loud, but it carried weight. There was no joke in his tone, no hesitation. He meant it. The trainer shook his head in disbelief. "Sir, with all respect, this is a tough sport. Maybe you should sit down and watch." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. He replied, "I didn't come here to watch." Something in his voice silenced the laughter, if only for a moment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't arrogance. It was quiet conviction. the kind that only comes from experience. The fighters kept laughing, but now their curiosity grew. Who was this man? Why was he here? Why did he seem so sure of himself? He stepped away from the ropes, heading back to the bench. He slipped on his old gloves, the leather faded but still sturdy. He flexed his hands inside them, tightening the straps with a firmness that made a few jaws tighten. His movements were not those of a beginner. They were smooth, practiced, confident. The whispers began to shift. Some still mocked, others began to wonder. Maybe he wasn't just some old man. Maybe, just maybe, he knew something they didn't. Without another word, the elderly man walked back toward the ring. His steps were slow but steady, unshaken by the noise around him. The gym had mocked him, laughed at him, ridiculed him. But the moment he climbed through those ropes, everyone felt the atmosphere change. The stranger was no longer just an old man in their eyes. He was something else, something mysterious. And though they still laughed, deep down, a question had already begun to whisper inside their hearts. What if he's not here to be mocked? What if he's here to prove them all wrong? The gym had seen many kinds of people come and go, ambitious kids, cocky young men, and even seasoned boxers. But never someone like him. An elderly black man, stepping into their sacred space with quiet confidence, was too strange for them to take seriously. And when he said he wanted to spar, the room erupted like firecrackers. At first, it was whispers, quick and sharp, flying between the young fighters. "Look at him," one muttered with a smirk. "He can barely stand straight." Another snickered, "Is this a boxing gym or a retirement home?" The words spread like sparks on dry grass, and soon the whole gym was alive with laughter. The old man didn't answer. He tied his gloves, his head bowed slightly, his expression calm. His silence only fueled their mockery. The young boxers mistook his composure for weakness. One tall fighter with bulging muscles stepped forward, grinning wide. "Hey, Grandpa," he shouted across the gym. "You sure you're in the right place? This isn't a bingo hall." His friends laughed loudly, clapping their hands like an audience in a comedy show. Another chimed in. "Careful, old man. One punch and you'll crumble into dust." Even the trainer tried to hide a smile, though he shook his head to quiet them. But deep down, he too doubted. He had trained fighters for years and knew how brutal boxing could be. In his mind, this old stranger wouldn't last 30 seconds in the ring. The laughter grew crueler. Some young men started imitating his slow walk, bending their backs and dragging their feet, pretending to be fragile. Others coughed exaggeratedly, holding their chests and gasping. "Don't let him get a heart attack." The old man still said nothing. He stood by the corner of the ring, waiting. His eyes didn't flinch, didn't glare, didn't break. It was as if the noise around him didn't exist. But silence can be mistaken for weakness. And the more he ignored them, the louder they mocked. One fighter began shadowboxing in front of him, throwing exaggerated punches. "This is all it'll take," he laughed, pretending to knock himself out with his own fist. Another tapped the old man's shoulder and said mockingly, "Better go home before someone breaks you." For a moment, the room felt less like a gym and more like a stage where cruelty was the show. Everyone wanted to laugh at the expense of the stranger. Everyone wanted to prove that he didn't belong. Still, he did not break. Instead, he adjusted his gloves and took a step toward the ring. That simple movement silenced a few chuckles. There was something unsettling about how calm he remained. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply prepared, as if he already knew how the story would end. One young boxer, cocky and loud, couldn't resist. "Let me have him," he said, smirking at the trainer. "I'll finish this quick. No point wasting everyone's time." The trainer hesitated, then shrugged. If this man insisted on sparring, perhaps a quick lesson would send him home. The crowd cheered, sensing entertainment. Fighters gathered near the ropes, leaning in eagerly. They wanted to see the old man embarrassed. They wanted proof that youth always beat age. That strength always crushed weakness. As the arrogant young fighter warmed up, he shot sneering glances at the stranger. "Don't worry, Grandpa," he said with false sweetness. "I'll go easy on you. Don't want to send you to the hospital." The gym roared with laughter again. The old man finally raised his head. His eyes met the younger fighters. They were not angry, not afraid, just steady, calm, and sharp, like steel hidden beneath wrinkles. That look unsettled the young man for a brief second, though he covered it with another smirk. The mocking voices filled the gym once more. The crowd expected a show, a quick beatdown, a humiliating end. But what they didn't know was that their laughter would not last long. They didn't realize that in the quiet confidence of the stranger lay a storm they weren't ready for. The mocking was loud, cruel, and endless, but soon the gym would learn the truth. The laughter still echoed around the gym, bouncing off the walls like cruel music. Young fighters clapped each other on the back. Trainers shook their heads. And even the spectators who had gathered couldn't hide their smirks. Everyone thought they knew how the story would end, but the old man didn't respond to a single word. He didn't defend himself, didn't shout, didn't beg. He simply stood there, wrapping the last of his hand bandages with slow, steady movements. His silence was unnerving. To the young men, it looked like weakness. But to anyone paying close attention, it was something else entirely. Control. His eyes stayed calm, like a deep river that didn't reveal what lay beneath. While the younger boxers puffed their chests, flexed their muscles, and barked insults to prove their dominance, he simply breathed. Every motion was deliberate. Every step had weight. There was no rush in him. He looked like a man who had already walked through storms, who had no reason to be rattled by a few drops of rain. One of the fighters shouted, "Come on, old man, say something. Are you scared already?" The crowd laughed again. But the stranger did not even blink. He sat on the bench, laced his worn gloves tightly, and stood up. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his arms, and moved toward the ring with the rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The laughter wavered for a moment. It wasn't just the way he moved, it was the way he carried himself. He didn't wobble like someone frail. He didn't hesitate like someone new. His steps were steady, measured, like a soldier marching toward duty. The gym had expected a clown. But what they saw now made them pause, even if just for a breath. The arrogant young fighter, chosen to spar with him, sneered louder to hide his own nerves. "Don't worry, everyone," he said, raising his fists for show. "This won't take long. I'll tuck him into bed by the first round." Laughter followed, but weaker this time, forced. The stranger climbed into the ring. He didn't stumble. He didn't need help. He stepped between the ropes with practiced ease, like someone returning to a place he knew well. He touched his gloves together once, then settled into the corner. His stance was relaxed, but balanced. He looked neither proud nor nervous, just ready. The trainer standing by the ring folded his arms, watching closely now. He had seen thousands of boxers over the years. He knew the difference between someone pretending and someone who truly understood the sport. And though he hadn't admitted it out loud yet, something about the way the old man stood made his heart beat a little faster. The crowd shouted more insults, trying to crack his calmness. "Don't trip on your cane. Watch your back, Grandpa." But no matter what they said, the man's face didn't change. His lips stayed firm, his eyes steady. He looked at the younger fighter not with fear, not with hatred, but with quiet recognition, as if he had seen fighters like him many times before. The bell hadn't even rung yet. But the atmosphere shifted. Some of the fighters leaned forward, their curiosity beginning to rise. They had expected panic, excuses, maybe even the old man backing out at the last minute. But instead, they saw stillness. They saw focus. It was a kind of confidence that didn't shout, didn't need to be announced. It was silent. And silent confidence is the kind that unsettles the loudest opponents. The young fighter bounced on his toes, smirking, trying to look fearless. But deep down, a question scratched at his pride. Why isn't this man afraid of me? The stranger adjusted his stance slightly, raising his gloves. The room, filled with noise moments before, began to quiet down. Not completely, but enough for the sound of his gloves brushing against each other to be heard. For 20 minutes, they had mocked him. But now, for the first time, they began to wonder. The old man's silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. It began to feel like something else, something heavier, something sharper. It was the silence of a man who didn't need to prove himself with words, because he intended to prove himself with action. And though the crowd still chuckled nervously, their laughter no longer rang with certainty. It carried doubt, because in that ring, standing calm as stone, the elderly stranger didn't look like a fool. He looked like a fighter. The gym smelled of sweat and adrenaline. Heavy bags swung in the corners, ropes slapped against the floor, and the metallic ding of the bell echoed every few minutes. But now, all that background noise was drowned out by the crowd forming around the central ring. Word spread quickly. The old man was about to spar. The young fighters leaned on the ropes, their faces bright with excitement. They weren't expecting a contest, they were expecting entertainment. For them, this wasn't a fight. It was a show, a joke, a story they'd tell for weeks about the day a gray-haired stranger stepped into their gym in the middle of the ring. The chosen fighter warmed up, bouncing on his toes, throwing sharp jabs into the air. He was young, strong, full of energy. His muscles glistened with sweat. His confidence radiated like a spotlight. He flexed for his friends, smirking at the old man who stood calmly in the opposite corner. "Don't worry, Grandpa," he said loudly, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I'll finish you quick. No need to call the ambulance." His friends laughed, banging on the ropes, shouting encouragements that sounded more like insults. The old man didn't reply. He just tightened his gloves, exhaled slowly, and fixed his eyes on his opponent. No words, no smiles. Just focus. The trainer looked uneasy. He had allowed the spar to happen, but something about the old man's calmness bothered him. He didn't look lost. He didn't look unsure. He looked prepared, and that unsettled the trainer more than he cared to admit. The bell rang. The young fighter rushed forward, throwing light jabs, his grin wide as he danced around. He wasn't taking it seriously. His punches were playful, more for the audience than the opponent. The crowd roared with laughter, cheering him on. "Teach him a lesson." Someone shouted, but the old man didn't flinch. He raised his guard, moved his head slightly, and stepped back with measured precision. His feet were slow, yes, but not clumsy. Every step was deliberate, balanced, controlled. His eyes never left the young fighter. "Come on." The young boxer taunted, flicking a jab near his face. "Is that all you got? Too slow." He danced, threw another jab, and laughed when it missed. Still, the old man stayed calm. His breathing was steady, his gloves high, his body relaxed. He was reading, watching, waiting. The crowd grew louder, sensing dominance from the younger fighter. They shouted, clapped, even jeered at the stranger. "Fall already, old man. Don't break your bones." Laughter filled the air again, but underneath it, a thin layer of tension had begun to build. Because every time the young fighter threw, the old man moved just enough to avoid it. He didn't waste energy. He didn't swing wildly. He just slipped, blocked, and stepped aside. Slowly, those watching began to notice. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was comfortable. The young fighter's smile began to fade. His playful punches turned sharper, faster, more serious. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he pushed harder, but still, the old man slipped out of reach. The gym's laughter thinned. Some of the fighters stopped smiling altogether. The young man's pride burned. He lunged forward with a flurry of punches, determined to prove his strength. The crowd cheered wildly, but the old man absorbed them with calm defense. Blocking with his gloves, moving his head just enough, letting the punches slide past him. His body barely moved more than necessary, but his timing was perfect. The young fighter stepped back, panting, his grin gone completely. The room quieted. The mocking had turned into murmurs. The stranger had not thrown a single punch, yet he was still standing steady, unharmed. Unshaken, the old man finally moved. Just one step forward. Just one shift of his weight. And with that simple motion, the entire gym felt something they hadn't expected. Fear. It wasn't the fear of danger, not yet. It was the fear of realization. The kind of fear that whispers, maybe we were wrong. Maybe he isn't a joke. Maybe he knows exactly what he's doing. The trainer's eyes narrowed, his chest tight. He recognized that look. He had seen it before in seasoned fighters who had mastered their craft. It was the look of a man who didn't need to prove himself with words because he would let his fists do the talking. The bell rang again, ending the round. The young fighter returned to his corner, breathing heavily, his pride bruised. The old man stood straight, barely sweating, his calmness intact. He hadn't thrown a single punch yet, but he had already shifted the atmosphere of the gym. The challenge had begun. But it wasn't the old man being tested anymore. It was the entire gym, their arrogance, their laughter, their assumptions, and deep down, they all felt it. The silence before a storm. The second round began with the same bell, but the sound felt different this time. The first time it rang, the gym had been full of laughter and jeers. Now the room was quieter, the voices softer, the eyes sharper. Something about the old man's calmness unsettled them. He hadn't thrown a single punch, but he hadn't been touched either. The young fighter bounced on his toes again, forcing a grin, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his chest. "All right, Grandpa," he muttered under his breath. Time to end this. His pride wouldn't let him lose face. He had to prove himself not just for the crowd, but for his own ego. He came forward with sharp jabs, snapping them toward the old man's face. The punches were fast, crisp, the kind that would have rattled a beginner. But the old man wasn't rattled. His head tilted slightly to the side, the jab sliding past his cheek. Another jab, another slip. A hook came flying, blocked neatly with a raised glove. The sound of gloves meeting gloves echoed, louder than the crowd's whispers. Thump, thump. Each block was clean, each slip exact. The old man wasn't wasting energy. He wasn't even breathing hard. He was studying, reading, learning. Hit him harder. Someone shouted from outside the ring. The young fighter obeyed, throwing a combination of jab, cross, left hook. It should have landed, but the old man moved with surprising sharpness. He pivoted, his foot sliding just enough to angle his body. The punches sliced through empty air. The gym gasped. It was the first sound of surprise, real surprise. The young fighter stumbled slightly, confused. How could this man, with gray hair and a slow walk, move like that? He tried again, faster this time, his fists flying like machine gun fire. But the stranger's defense was like water. He flowed, he absorbed. He let the punches pass without panic. His gloves, his shoulders, his head movement tall, precise, all controlled. And then, it happened. The old man threw his first punch. Just one. A short, simple jab. It wasn't fast, it wasn't flashy, but it landed, pop, right on the young fighter's nose. Not enough to hurt, but enough to shock. The young man blinked, stunned. He hadn't even seen it coming. The crowd erupted, not with laughter this time, but with noise of disbelief. Did you see that? He landed. Murmurs swept the gym. The trainer's eyes widened, his arms crossing tighter over his chest. The young fighter snarled, embarrassed. His pride burned hotter than the sting on his nose. "Lucky shot," he muttered, raising his gloves higher. He lunged forward again, swinging hooks, trying to crush the old man quickly. But the stranger's defense held firm. Another slip, another block, another pivot, and then another jab. Pop, right between the gloves, landing clean. The young fighter staggered back half a step. His friends fell silent. Nobody was laughing now. The old man didn't press forward recklessly. He didn't waste energy chasing. He stayed calm, waiting for the next mistake. His eyes never blinked, locked onto the young fighter with laser focus. He looked less like a tired old man and more like a hunter, patient and precise. The young man's breathing grew heavier. He swung again, desperate to land something, anything. The old man ducked under the punch and, with fluid ease, tapped him on the ribs with a short right hand. Not a hard punch, just a reminder. Thud, the young fighter grunted. His face flushed with frustration. "Fight me for real," he shouted. But the old man was fighting for real, just not in the way his opponent expected. The gym grew quieter with every passing second. The rhythm of the fight had changed. No longer was it the young man showing off and the crowd laughing. Now it was the old man's calm control versus the young man's frantic pride. Every slip, every jab, every small counter told a story the crowd couldn't ignore. They leaned closer, their mocking smiles fading into serious stares. Some whispered to each other, "He knows what he's doing. Look at his form. That's not luck." For the first time, respect began to replace ridicule. The bell rang again, ending the round. The young fighter returned to his corner, panting, sweat dripping down his face. His smile was gone completely now. He stared at the old man with a mixture of anger and fear. The stranger, meanwhile, stood tall, his breathing steady, his face calm. He rolled his shoulders once, tightened his gloves, and nodded to himself as if everything was going exactly as he planned. The crowd felt it too. Something was building. The old man had shown just enough to prove he wasn't a joke. But deep down, everyone knew he hadn't shown everything yet. The storm was coming. The air in the gym was different now. Gone was the laughter. Gone was the mocking. What remained was a thick silence, broken only by the sound of gloves brushing against skin and shoes squeaking lightly against the canvas. Every pair of eyes was locked on the ring, waiting, wondering what would happen next. The young fighter sat in his corner between rounds, breathing hard, sweat dripping down his chest. He had come into this spar certain of an easy victory, ready to humiliate the stranger. But instead of a helpless old man, he had found someone who slipped, blocked, and jabbed with unsettling precision. His pride was wounded, and his anger was rising. "Finish him," one of his friends whispered from outside the ropes. "Don't hold back." The bell rang. The young fighter jumped up, fists high, determination burning in his eyes. He charged forward like a storm, throwing combinations with all the strength he had left. His gloves sliced through the air, pounding forward in wild fury. The crowd roared encouragement, desperate to see their man reclaim control. But the old man remained calm. He didn't flinch, didn't panic. He slipped left, ducked low, stepped back, letting the punches miss by inches. Each move was clean, economical. His eyes stayed locked on his opponent, sharp and steady, like a hawk circling prey. The young fighter grew reckless. He swung harder, faster, desperate to land the punch that would silence the whispers growing in the gym. But in his desperation, he left openings the old man saw clearly. And then, the moment came. The young fighter lunged forward with a wide right hook, his body overextended, his chin exposed. The old man's eyes flashed. In a split second, his body coiled like a spring. He dipped low, pivoted his hips, and let his fist rise with brutal precision. Wham! The uppercut exploded upward, connecting perfectly beneath the young man's chin. The sound cracked through the gym like thunder. The young fighter's head snapped back. His body lifted slightly off the canvas before stumbling backward, his legs buckling beneath him. Time seemed to slow. The crowd gasped as one. Their voices sucked out of the room, leaving only silence. The young man crashed to the mat, his gloves slipping against the floor as he tried to steady himself. His eyes were dazed, his mouth open in shock. The arrogance, the laughter, the cockiness gone in a single punch. The gym was frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire room had been struck silent by the force of that uppercut. The old man didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his fists or shout. He simply stepped back, lowered his gloves, and stood quietly in his corner. His breathing was calm, his face steady. To him, this wasn't about showing off, was about proving a point. Seconds ticked by before the silence finally broke. A few gasps turned into murmurs. Murmurs turned into disbelief. Disbelief turned into awe. Did you see that? One fighter whispered. That punch. Another muttered, shaking his head. Perfect. The trainer, who had doubted the stranger from the start, stood frozen at the edge of the ring. He had trained dozens of fighters, seen countless matches, but rarely had he seen a punch so clean, so timed, so devastating. It wasn't raw power. It was skill, mastery, and patience combined into a single strike. The young fighter groaned on the canvas, embarrassed and broken. His pride hurt more than his jaw. He had underestimated the man standing over him. And now he had been silenced, just like the rest of the gym. The old man finally looked around. His eyes met the crowd's, calm but sharp, as if to say, "This is why I came. This is why I didn't speak." He didn't need words. His fists had spoken louder than anything he could have said. Slowly, he pulled off his gloves, setting them neatly on the corner stool. He didn't strut. He didn't smirk. He simply walked to the ropes, climbed down with steady steps, and picked up his old duffel bag. The crowd parted for him, silent. Their mocking replaced by respect. The young fighters who had laughed the loudest now lowered their eyes, ashamed. The ones who had copied his walk now stood frozen, unable to move. The ones who had shouted cruel jokes now whispered to each other, stunned by what they had witnessed in a single uppercut. The old man had not only silenced his opponent, he had silenced an entire room, and as he walked slowly toward the gym doors, the lesson hung heavy in the air, stronger than the smell of sweat, louder than the pounding of the heavy bags. Never judge a fighter by age. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never confuse dignity with defeat. The stranger had entered the gym mocked and ridiculed. He left as a legend. For a long moment, the gym stood frozen. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the young fighter still on the mat. His pride shattered by the single punch that had flipped the room upside down. The laughter that had once filled the air was gone. No jeers, no jokes. Just silence so thick that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed loud. The elderly man stood tall in the center of the ring. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his arms, didn't celebrate. His face remained calm, almost expressionless. As if the devastating uppercut had meant nothing more to him than tying his shoelaces. To him, it wasn't a victory. It was simply proof. Slowly, the young fighter rolled to his knees, clutching the ropes as he struggled to stand. His jaw ached, his vision blurred, and his chest heaved with embarrassment. A few of his friends tried to help him, but he shoved them away, too ashamed to accept their hands. He looked at the old man with a mix of fear, respect, and wounded pride. This wasn't the spar he had imagined. This wasn't the easy humiliation he had promised the crowd. The old man stepped closer, not with aggression, but with grace. He extended his glove, offering to touch hands in respect. The young fighter hesitated, then slowly lifted his own, tapping the old man's glove weakly. It was a silent acknowledgement. "You are not who I thought you were. You are better." That small gesture broke the tension in the room. The fighters surrounding the ring began to murmur, not with ridicule, but with awe. "Did you see his timing?" One whispered. "That uppercut was perfect." Another shook his head, still stunned. He didn't even break a sweat. The trainer, who had doubted him from the start, finally stepped forward. His voice carried more weight than the others, and for the first time it was filled with sincerity. "That wasn't luck," he said softly. "That was skill. Real skill." Heads nodded around the gym. The truth was undeniable. What they had witnessed wasn't some fluke or accident. It was the work of a man who had lived and breathed boxing long before most of them were even born. The wrinkles on his face, the gray in his hair, the slow walk, they weren't signs of weakness. They were scars of experience, proof of a life dedicated to the sport. One of the younger fighters, the same one who had mocked him the loudest when he entered, now looked down at the floor, ashamed. He finally raised his voice, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was quiet. "I'm sorry, sir." The words cut through the room, heavy with sincerity. The old man didn't respond. He didn't need to. Respect had already been earned, not through speeches, not through demands, but through action. Slowly, others stepped forward. "Can you show me that move again?" One asked shyly. Another added, "I've never seen defense like that. Will you teach us?" The gym that had once laughed at him now looked at him like a master, a teacher, someone they wanted to learn from. The elderly man said nothing at first. He took off his gloves slowly, placing them neatly on the stool in his corner. His hands, rough and aged, trembled slightly as he unwrapped the faded bandages. Then he looked up at the eager faces around him. His voice, when it came, was steady and quiet. "Boxing is not about showing off," he said simply. "It's about patience, timing, respect." Remember that the words hit harder than any punch. The fighters who had mocked him earlier now stood silent, their heads nodding slowly, their eyes full of something new: humility. They had come to watch an old man be humiliated, but instead, they had been humbled themselves. The young fighter who had faced him lowered his head, ashamed but grateful. He knew that uppercut would stay with him forever, not as humiliation, but as a lesson that age does not erase skill. That silence can hold more power than arrogance. That respect must always be given before it is earned back tenfold. As the old man gathered his things, the trainer approached him. "Sir," he said quietly, his tone now heavy with respect, "if you ever want to teach here, this gym will always welcome you." The stranger gave a small nod, nothing more. He slung his old duffel over his shoulder and stepped out of the ring. The crowd parted for him, not because they pitied him, but because they honored him. Every head turned as he walked toward the door. The same door he had entered through, mocked and ridiculed, he now exited through as a figure of quiet greatness. No one dared laugh. No one dared sneer. Instead, they watched him go, their hearts carrying the weight of the lesson he had given without ever raising his voice. Respect had been earned. Not demanded, not begged for, but earned through truth, through action. Through one perfect uppercut that had silenced the room. *, the gym door closed softly behind him. But the silence he left behind was louder than any cheer could ever be. The fighter stood still, staring at the empty space where the old man had walked out. For the first time that day, they weren't thinking about themselves, their muscles, or their pride. They were thinking about him, the stranger who had entered quietly, been mocked loudly, and left as a man who had silenced them all with a single uppercut. The young fighter sat on the bench, his gloves half off, staring at the floor. He replayed the moment in his mind over and over, the calmness in the old man's eyes, the perfect timing of that punch, the shock of hitting the canvas before he even understood what had happened. Shame still stung in his chest, but beneath it, something else stirred. Respect. For the first time, he realized boxing wasn't about showing off or proving who was stronger. It was about patience, discipline, and wisdom. Lessons his arrogance had blinded him from seeing until today. Around the gym, whispers turned into reflections. He moved like he had been doing this all his life. One fighter murmured. Another added, it wasn't power. It was control. He knew exactly when to strike. The younger ones, who had laughed the hardest earlier, now sat quietly. Their pride shaken, but their minds opened. The trainer stood with his arms crossed, staring at the ring. His voice was low, but heavy. You all better remember this day. Strength fades. Youth fades. But skill stays forever. Respect the sport, or it will humble you just like he humbled all of us today. The words sank deep into the room. Heads nodded. Eyes dropped. The gym no longer felt like the same place it had been an hour ago. The arrogance that once filled it had drained away, replaced by something far more powerful: humility. The old man's lesson went beyond boxing. It wasn't just about throwing punches or landing uppercuts. It was about life itself. His silence had taught them that sometimes dignity speaks louder than words. His calmness had shown that true confidence doesn't need to boast. And his punch, that single devastating punch, had reminded them that greatness has no age, no expiration, no weakness when it comes from the heart. In the days that followed, the story of that spar spread beyond the gym walls. Fighters told it to their friends, who told it to others, until it became almost legend. They spoke of the elderly man who walked in alone, faced ridicule, and left as a hero. They repeated his words. Boxing is not about showing off. It's about patience, timing, respect, each time they said it. The weight of that truth grew heavier. For the young fighter who had stood across from him, the lesson cut the deepest. He returned to the gym every day, not with arrogance, but with humility. He trained harder, listened more, and carried the memory of that uppercut with him like a scar, one that shamed him, but one that reminded him to stay grounded. Years later, when he himself became a trainer, he often told his students about that day. Don't underestimate anyone, he would say. Respect every fighter. Because the moment you don't, that's the moment you'll fall. The gym changed, too. The mocking and arrogance that once poisoned the air slowly disappeared. Fighters carried themselves differently. They trained with more discipline, treated each other with more respect. The echo of laughter that had once mocked the stranger was replaced with determination inspired by him. His presence lingered even in his absence. Nobody ever saw the old man again. He never returned to the gym, never explained who he was or where he had trained. He remained a mystery. Some guessed he had been a professional once, maybe even a champion who had walked away from the spotlight. Others believed he was simply a man who had never forgotten the beauty of the sport. Whatever the truth, it didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson he had left behind. And so, the story lived on. It was whispered to newcomers, shared among trainers, and carried in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. They didn't remember him as the old man who came to the gym. They remembered him as the fighter who silenced the room with a single uppercut. Because in the end, it wasn't just a punch. It was a reminder never to judge a book by its cover, never to measure strength only by youth, and never to forget that respect is the soul of boxing and of life. The stranger had entered mocked. He had left respected, and his lesson was remembered forever.